Welcome back to Respondent Behavior. This is video part 6, beginning with Objective 18, State Mentalistic Explanations of Respondent Conditioning, issued in Behavior Analysis. Objective 19 is to list variables that influence the effectiveness of respondent conditioning. 20 is to state the major difference between first order and higher order conditioning. 21 is to list 3 major respondent processes. 22 is to define and describe habituation, which is one of those major respondent processes. So, Objective 18, State Mentalistic Explanations of Respondent Conditioning, issued in Behavior Analysis. Now, I mentioned this briefly before, but we're just going to discuss it a little bit more. Psychologists and neuroscientists try to explain respondent conditioning phenomena using explanatory fictions. So explanatory fictions include the animal predicts on the basis of the CS that the US will occur. Right? So that's one way neuroscientists and psychologists try to explain how the animal learns from the pairing procedure, from the respondent conditioning procedure, is that the animal predicts. So it might be explained this way. So as a result of repeated pairing of the CS with the US, now the animal learns to predict that the US will occur when the CS occurs, and that's why the animal is eliciting or is engaging in the reflex response when the CS occurs. It's because it predicts that the US is about to occur. Well, the prediction part is the explanatory fiction. It doesn't. This explanation doesn't explain learning in terms of environmental variables exclusively. The animal expects the meat powder will follow the bell, and so that's why the animal elicits that's why the animal salivates when the meat powder is not only when the meat powder is presented, but when the bell is presented. Okay. Or the animal knows that the bell and the meat powder are associated. Again, knowing is not an environmental explanation, it's an explanatory fiction. The animal associates the bell with the meat powder. We talked about that earlier, and I explained that the animal isn't associating anything. The experimenter associates the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. The animal is surprised by the stimulus, and that's why they respond the way they do. No, we reject that explanation. The animal remembers or forgets that the bell predicts the occurrence of the meat powder. Okay, so predicts, expects, knows, associates, surprised, remembers, or forgets. These are explanatory fictions. They're not. They neither can be classified as behavior or environment, so they don't fit in. They can't be used. They're not environmental explanations for behavior, so they're not compatible with behavior analysis or applied behavior analysis and how we explain behavior. Okay, so Objective 19 is to list variables that influence the effectiveness of respondent conditioning. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on these. It's important for you to be able to list these at later stages of your academic training and your career. It's going to be important to be able to think about these things. But for now, just focus on listing them. So these are variables that can influence whether how effective or how fast respondent conditioning is. So the CS-US temporal relation, so the interval between the CS and the US, is one variable. Another is the length of the inner trial interval, so that will be the time between one trial and another. And then you have biological preparedness. In other words, certain organisms or certain species are predisposed to learn certain conditioned reflex responses whereas other organisms or other species may not even be able to learn the same conditioned reflex response. So biology and genetics plays a role in the effectiveness of respondent conditioning. The intensity of the CS in the US, the number of CS-US pairings, the duration of the CS in the US, the reliability of the US to elicit a UR. So the stronger or the more consistently or reliably the US elicits the unconditioned reflex response, the more effective respondent conditioning is going to be. Prior exposure to the CS, that is, exposure to the CS prior to respondent conditioning. The novelty of the CS. Similarity of the CS to the US, so physical similarity, the extent to which they look or sound the same, or perhaps taste the same, or smell the same. Fatigue. Sickness. And the strength of the stimulus-stimulus contingency. So those are probably not all of the variables that could influence the effectiveness of respondent conditioning, but there's quite a few here, and so this should give you at least some familiarity with how complex respondent conditioning is and how sensitive it is to a number of variables. Okay, objective 20 is to state the major difference between first order and higher order conditioning. So far, we've only discussed first order conditioning. That's where you have a neutral stimulus paired with an unconditioned stimulus multiple times. The contingent pairing has a function altering effect, which turns the neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. And it's first order conditioning because the neutral stimulus was paired with an unconditioned stimulus. You can contrast that with higher order conditioning, and the difference here is that the neutral stimulus is paired with a conditioned stimulus. See over here, unconditioned. So in first order conditioning, you pair a neutral stimulus with unconditioned stimulus. In higher order conditioning, you pair a neutral stimulus with a conditioned stimulus. And as a result of pairing, it has the same functional altering effect. It turns that neutral stimulus into the second conditioned stimulus and establishes another conditioned reflex. So this is higher order conditioning. So I'll give you an example. You could repeatedly pair light with a tone. And in fact, let's back up a little bit. You could first do first order conditioning where you pair a tone with an eliciting stimulus, or with an unconditioned elicitor, US. Okay, so you repeatedly pair the tone with an unconditioned stimulus. All right, and over time, in repeated pairings, that procedure alters the function of the tone and turns it into a conditioned stimulus. Now we're going to pair the tone, the CS, with another neutral stimulus, a light. You repeatedly pair them, and now the pairing alters the function of the light and turns it into a second conditioned stimulus. And now there's a new conditioned reflex. And so the light now elicits the conditioned reflex response. So that would be higher order conditioning. ASR 21, the primary difference between first order and higher order conditioning is A, an NS is paired with another NS, B, an NS is paired with a US, C, an NS is paired with a CS. A few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is C, and NS is paired with a CS. ASR 21, Objective 21, list 3 major respondent processes. So I'm just going to list them here, and then we're going to go into detail. Habituation, potentiation, and sensitization. 22 is define and describe habituation. So habituation is a behavioral response decrement that results from repeated stimulation. That's a definition from Rankin et al. 2008. Another way to say that is habituation is a decrease in a reflex response due to repeated stimulation. Habituation has a dimension-altering effect on the reflex response. That means it weakens the reflex response. The response decrement is not due to sensory adaptation, sensory fatigue, or motor fatigue. It is a weakening of the reflex response, or the response part of the reflex. The permanence is that habituation is temporary. Okay, it only lasts a little while, and then later on the reflex response returns to full strength. The process of habituation was originally tied only to respondent behavior, but now it's been conceptualized to apply to operant stimuli as well. And Rankin et al. 2008 identified and described 10 critical features. We're not going to get into that in this lecture, but I just want to let you know of that recent development in the relatively recent development in the scientific literature. It will be concerned with habituation as it pertains to the relation between an eliciting stimulus and a reflex response, so as a respondent process. Here's a quick example of habituation. Cohen, Hoffman, Kelly, and Anday in 1988 conducted a study with newborn infants, and the participants were 15 infants ages 17 to 58 hours old, so they were just born, and another group of which consisted of 15 adults ages 18 to 35 years. And what they studied is habituation of the glabellar reflex response between groups to see if they differed. And so this picture here is a picture of the device, and the glabellar reflex is an eye blink elicited by a tap on the forehead, just between and above the eyes. And in fact, tests of this reflex are used to assess the possible presence of neurological disorders. And they measured the amplitude of the glabellar reflex. And the independent variable, that is what they manipulated as they measured the amplitude of the glabellar reflex, consisted of 150 taps to the glabella at an interstimulus interval of 4 seconds. The graph data are presented here. On the x-axis, they displayed trial blocks, so each one of these is a block of 3 trials, so this is the 15th block, the 20th block, and so forth. On the y-axis, they displayed the mean eye blink amplitude. And infants are represented by this broken line, and adults are represented by this solid line. As you can see, across blocks, the amplitude of the glabellar reflex decreased gradually in the adults, but there was not a decrease in the infants, suggesting that the process of habituation, at least with respect to the amplitude of the glabellar reflex, is dependent on maturation or development. So that's just an example of how researchers might, can study habituation in humans in laboratory settings. Okay, non-examples of habituation. After eating most of the grapes in the bowl, you leave a few and toss them out. All right, that's a different type of behavior. That's not habituation. Just because you stop eating grapes doesn't mean that reflects a habituation process. Eating grapes isn't a reflex response, so it doesn't apply. The student answers many questions posed in class by the teacher, then they stop answering questions temporarily. So we wouldn't say that the student habituated to the teacher asking questions or something like that. The student answering questions is engaging in something called operant behavior. We'll talk about that in the next unit. Answering questions isn't a reflex response, so this gradual decrease in answering questions can't be referred to or explained by the process of habituation. The beagle howled and when you said speak several times. After saying speak 5 times, the beagle stopped howling and rolled over. Well, howling isn't a reflex response here, so it can't be a habituation even though there's a gradual decrease. The dentist asked the child to say ah so that he could inspect their teeth. The child refused to open their mouth and said they are afraid they have a cavity. And it's a different type of behavior. It's not respondent, so it can't be anything like habituation. And you play peekaboo with the infant smiles the first few times, then they stop smiling. That's not habituation. ASR 22, habituation is A, a reflex, B, a conditioning procedure, C, a process, or D, all of the above. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is C, a process. ASR 23. Habituation is characterized by A, an increase in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus, or B, a decrease in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. C, first-order conditioning response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus, or D, a decrease in the eye blink response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is B. It's a decrease in the reflex response following repeated presentation of a single stimulus. If you chose A, you may not have noticed that it says increase instead of decrease. There's no such thing as a first-order conditioning response. And then this is a decrease in the eye blink response. Well, that would be an example of habituation, but it's not a characteristic of habituation. Habituation can involve other reflex responses, of course, or it applies to reflex responses in general. Okay, here are our next objectives. So I think we're going to end this video part, and I'll see you in the next video part beginning with objective 23.